So for the past 3 weeks, we have been reading the Passover story in the first 12 chapters of the book of Exodus. And as part of that dramatic story, I will read this section, starting with chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 1. Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should heed God and I should heed this God and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." They answered, "The God of the Hebrews has manifested God's self to us. Let us go, we pray, a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest God strikes us with pestilence or sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you distract the people from their tasks? Get to your labors." And Pharaoh continued, "The people of the land are already so numerous, and you would have them cease from their labors?" That same day, Pharaoh charged the taskmasters and 4 men of the people, saying, "You shall no longer provide the people with straw for making bricks as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, but impose upon them the same quota of bricks as they have been making up until now. Do not reduce it, for they are shirkers. That is why they cry, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Let heavier work be laid upon the men. Let them keep at it and not pay attention to deceitful promises." So the taskmasters and 4 men of the people went out and said to the people, "Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you any straw. You must go and get the straw yourselves wherever you can find it, but there shall be no decrease whatever in your work." Then the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. And the taskmasters pressed them, saying, "You must complete the same work assignment each day as when you had straw." And the 4 men of the Israelites, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten. "Why," they were asked, "did you not complete the prescribed amounts of bricks, either yesterday or today, as you did before?" Then the 4 men of the Israelites came to Pharaoh and cried, "Why do you deal this way with your servants? No straw is issued to your servants, yet they demand of us, 'Make bricks.' Thus your servants are being beaten when the fault is with your own people." He replied, "You are shirkers. That is why you say, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Be off now to your work. No straw shall be issued to you, but you must produce your quota of bricks." Now the 4 men of the Israelites found themselves in trouble because of the order, "You must not reduce your daily quantity of bricks." As they left Pharaoh's presence, they came upon Moses and Aaron standing in their path, and they said to them, "May the Lord look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his courtiers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us." Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, Pharaoh has dealt worse with this people, and still you have not delivered your people." Then the Lord said to Moses, "You shall soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He shall let them go because of a greater might. Indeed, because of a greater might, he shall drive them from his land." We read here about the confusion inherent to resistance and the resistance to resistance. Pharaoh manipulates the underclass, the enslaved Hebrews, so that they will blame their increased suffering precisely upon those who are trying to liberate them. Pharaoh uses those who are most oppressed by the existing social order in order to protect that oppressive social order. This helps reinforce resistance to the resistance. both from its opponents and from the victims who are manipulated by its opponents. The useful idiots. Useful idiots. Idiots as in those who do not know or understand, who can therefore be manipulated. The enslaved Hebrews are given extra work so that they will then get angry at Moses and see no good in coming from their protest. And that will keep everything in place. The enslaved Hebrews here are at the beginning of a transition to a new normal. They do not know where things are going. They are frightened and unnerved, and this makes them vulnerable to manipulation. This past week, we entered into a new year on the Western calendar. And as we enter into 2022, we are in the midst of a transition to a new normal. A new normal. We have no idea where it is going. COVID is turning from pandemic to endemic. It seems pretty clear it will always be with us. Penn State scientists have found that the local deer population is heavily infected with COVID, which means that there will always be a reservoir for the virus ready to jump over into the human population. COVID has led to more use of remote technology and the building of remote community, which has already changed our world. But these are just small pieces of whatever our new normal is going to be. Climate change, which is also inevitable. The only question is, to what extent will the climate change? Climate change will bring great upheavals in rainfall, flooding, wildfires, shorelines, glacial activity, food production, and migration, leading to social upheaval and violence, all of which we are already seeing, even as we have not yet felt the full effects. And then there's the crisis of democracy, which is going to, tonight, occupy most of my time and thought, because that was yesterday. Yesterday was January 6th, and the United States marked the 1-year anniversary of the violent insurrection at the United States Capitol. And one of the things I learned for myself years ago was that there were two words I never wanted to say from the pulpit. And those two words were Republican and Democrat. My reasoning was that if I avoided saying Republican and Democrat from the pulpit, it could act as a guardrail for me against becoming too partisan when I brought up social issues from the pulpit, which itself is necessary. It's necessary to bring up social issues from the pulpit, because social issues and social policies are the embodiment of social ethics and social values. And social ethics and social values are essential elements to be spoken of from the pulpit. So I strive not to talk about Republicans versus Democrats from the pulpit. But then we come up against the 1-year anniversary of a direct and violent assault against democracy itself in the United States, of all places. And we find that Republicans refuse to be participants in the commemoration denouncing the attacks, with a smattering of exceptions, such as Congresswoman Liz Cheney and her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, who is now considered a Republican moderate. Yesterday, January 6th, basically only the Democrats marked the anniversary of the insurrection at the Capitol. This is remarkable and deeply troubling. Last year, in January, after the insurrection, I wrote an article and tried to submit it to Penn Live. I never heard back. But the title was, "Is the Republican Party a Threat to American Democracy?" And I followed that up quickly with the response, "What a question to have to ask but it is a serious one. And I wish to share some of what I wrote. Then, a year ago, I wrote, in 1923, a fledgling Nazi party staged a riot in Munich, attempting to overthrow the government. It failed, and many party members went to prison. But they eventually got out and continued their efforts. It took another 10 years, but through the combined use of armed militia to intimidate leaders and voters, and electoral candidates to infiltrate the political system, they eventually gained enough power to take over the government, expand executive power by declaring a state of emergency, and to destroy German democracy from within. Today in America, we have an existing insurrectionist movement that does not look to preserve American democracy as we know it. As a partial example, in 2016, we witnessed a 40-day armed occupation of a federal wildlife sanctuary in Oregon. Since then, in Michigan, we saw openly armed protesters intimidating legislators inside the State House, and the discovery of a plot to kidnap the governor. Movement participants often are white supremacists and have the right to be well armed due to lax gun laws that they are absolutely committed to making more lax. They are loosely organized, but the 2017 violent demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, titled Unite the Right, was one attempt to organize themselves together. On January 6th, we saw that movement come to Washington and storm the Capitol. For many people in that movement, January 6th was not a failure. For them, it was a success. They saw their insurrectionist desires reach onto the floors of the Capitol, into the chambers of power, and they are emboldened. Yet the Republican Party is still unable to clearly, boldly, decisively, and in unified fashion separate themselves from the insurrectionist part of their base. I need not tell you, since then, the Republican Party has doubled down on its denial of what happened on January 6th. It's now controversial in the Republican Party to say that the insurrection was violent. It is controversial to say that it was an insurrection. Last year, I went on to say, if the Republican Party does not find the courage to shake off the significant number of extremists within their ranks, they leave a pathway open for the following scenario. Here's the scenario. 10 years from now, but I wouldn't say 10 years now, I would say 2 years from now. The Republican Party, bolstered in part by conspiracy theories, wins controls of Congress, the presidency, and the courts. The three branches of government collude with each other and refuse to enforce checks and balances. Not one Republican legislator objects out of fear of being challenged by a right-wing candidate in the next primary. Armed right-wing militias exert fear and intimidation upon legislators and other elected appointed officials, impacting their official decisions. The president declares a state of emergency and claims wide powers exerted openly and secretly, which Republican legislators, drunk with power or cowed by fear, do nothing to limit. This may sound alarmist, but we've already seen how Trump, when president, was able to declare a state of emergency when there was, in fact, no emergency, in order to redirect billions of dollars to build a wall Congress had consistently refused to authorize. We saw how a Republican-led Senate refused to stop this and countless other abuses of power by a Republican president. We are seeing now how the military is searching its ranks for people, for right-wingers who and supporters of insurgency that may have infiltrated them. As of last year, some members of Congress already were taking into consideration fear for their personal safety when considering how they were to vote. And I'm still writing last year, even after the January 6th insurgency, over 140 Republican members of Congress still voted to uphold clearly baseless objections to results of the presidential election, including Scott Perry representing Harrisburg. And Scott Perry has been in the news since. Unfortunately, now, a year later, I have to add, we have seen laws changed in states wherever Republicans hold complete power in order to make voting harder and to loosen safeguards that protect vote counting from direct interference by sitting Republican politicians. 3 retired US Army generals published an article in the Washington Post recently warning, urging current military leaders that they must make plans now for how to respond to further, even more extreme repeats of such a Capitol insurrection in the future, especially if Republicans do not prevail in 2024. Additionally, a political science study out of the University of Chicago found in surveys conducted in the summer and the fall of this year that, and this is quoting now, 21 million American adults agree with 2 radical beliefs. 1, that the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency is justified, and 2, that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election and is an illegitimate president. That is 21 million don't hold just one of those beliefs, they hold both of those beliefs. That's 8% of the body politic, which is very significant. That really cannot easily be characterized as just the fringe. We normally think of the fringe as 1% or less, unquote. Additionally, these same scholars, looking at those who have been arrested for participating in the January 6th insurrection, concluded that the vast majority of the participants were not fringe elements, but were from the mainstream of society. Economically, professionally, in terms of education, military service, criminal record, or age, they are typical middle-class Americans. 42% of them get a lot of their news from Fox. Half of them come from counties that voted for Biden, not Trump. But that often makes them political minorities in their own neighborhoods. And they often come from counties where the white proportion of the population is decreasing, which provides them with anecdotal evidence to support the great replacement theory that non-whites are replacing and supplanting whites in America. This means that race is a definite underlying factor. But still, while 13% of the insurrectionists, according to the study, seem to have been connected to extremist groups, 87% were not. Which leads me to think of another study I once saw about leadership and the real power of the first follower. The power of the first follower, not the leader. If someone goes out and does some crazy outlandish thing, then at that moment, they are a wild outlier doing this crazy thing. But it's that second person. If a second person starts doing it with them, that can be the endorsement needed to get others to follow that crazy thing as well. In many ways, the second person, not the first person, the second person, the first follower, has a much greater impact on the rest of the people than that original initiator who was just doing something wild and non-normative. On January 6th, 13% of those gathered were of the fringe. It was the other 87% who followed and gave credence to the fringe. And then beyond that, it's the rest of the organized Republican Party who is giving credence to that. They've brought along the entire party, which has become a mortal threat to democracy and the republic itself. Amidst all of this is also the problem of Christian nationalism, where it seems that close to 20% of Americans think that the United States Constitution is divinely inspired, which means that they could find justification to use the Constitution in an authoritative way to undo democracy in order to impose a quote unquote more correct social order upon society, regardless of what the majority think. We need to realize that democracy as we know it was not an original part of the constitutional order put into place in America in 1789. The authors of the Constitution were very afraid of where democracy could lead. They were already thinking in terms of what was about to be and what became the French Revolution. They were very concerned about mobocracy. So they were not in favor of democracy as we understand it now. The Constitution wasn't written necessarily to support democracy as we know it now. So now that we have large numbers of politicians, judges, and Supreme Court justices who hold to the formerly radical legal theory of original intent, which is to say the Constitution must be read according to the way it was originally intended, but it wasn't originally intended to sustain democracy as we know it. So America is faced with the prospect of some form of constitutional authoritarianism being imposed upon us regardless of the will of the majority. And that, so even if the next violent insurgency fails. There is much more that could be said, but I promised myself that this would not become a manifesto. I will say that we need to be thinking and speaking and acting more boldly about issues of power more than ever before. Rhetorical power, electoral power, economic power, legal power, judicial power, political power. I think the forces for democracy and for good in society need to be speaking clearly, bluntly, and openly about brute power, what power is and what power looks like. I don't think we talk about it enough. While the apparatchiks who work the Republican machine think about power only. Power is the only operative criterion we see anymore in what remains of the Republican Party. Nothing they do seems dedicated to making life better for the average person, or even for protecting the national interests of the United States in the international diplomatic arena. Every move we see them make is about acquiring and retaining power, and especially on keeping power from the hands of the inevitable majority of people in America with brown skin. The Exodus story, the Passover story, on a basic level, is a story about power. We have the power of the God of Israel versus the power of Pharaoh, the God of Egypt. And throughout the narrative, throughout all those chapters, we see this power struggle playing out. The enslaved Hebrews are pawns in this struggle as Pharaoh increases their burdens in order to alienate them from Moses and the God whom Moses represents. The average Egyptians become collateral damage in the struggle as they experience the 10 plagues. Ultimately, the Hebrews win the change of status they seek, moving from being avadim, slaves of Pharaoh, to becoming avadim, servants of the God of Israel. The 4 cups of the Passover Seder derive from the section of the Torah that immediately follows what I read. Each of the 4 cups represents one of the 4 promises set forth in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. Those verses are, "Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am Adonai. I will free you from the labor of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary judgments, and I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God." These 4 promises are the basis of the 4 cups of the Passover Seder. The Passover story is about power and rescue and about faithfulness. Faithfulness being the commitment to doing the right thing. That's what faithfulness is, the commitment to do the right thing. So I'm not saying just to celebrate holidays and pray, but I am saying to pray and meditate and contemplate and try to envision ways forward that strengthen democracy, what Churchill called the worst form of government except for all the others. I'm not saying just study, but I am saying study Torah, which includes wisdom and history and insights to human nature and politics, to see better what our experience and our tradition and our teaching can help us bring to the situation that will help us all move forward. And on the basis of prayer and study, I am saying to speak and to act and to pay attention and to warn and to network and to bring people together, to project louder voices, and ultimately to project power. There is more at stake than most of us realize as we move into a new normal. So, a lot to think about, study about, pray about the rest of Shabbat and beyond. Welcome to 2022.